On September 7th, 1876, three heavily armed men stepped inside the First National Bank at Northfield, Minnesota. They immediately pulled their six-shooters and hopped over the counter, demanding that the cashier open the safe. When he refused, he was viciously beaten, and when another employee made a break for freedom, one of the desperados shot him in the back. Still, though, that brave cashier refused to comply. Meanwhile, the bandits keeping watch outside, including the infamous Jesse James, were likewise facing resistance. And within just a few short minutes, the gang was absolutely riddled with bullets. Turns out the good folks of Northfield weren't quite as docile as the outlaws assumed, and they most definitely were not in the mood to have their bank robbed. This raid on Northfield was the most bold and daring robbery that Jesse James had yet committed. It also proved to be an abject failure, one that spelled the end for the James Younger gang. But what really occurred there in Northfield? Why did Jesse James choose Minnesota as a target? What went wrong during the robbery? And more importantly, just who exactly were those brave citizens who stood up and declared, "Not today"? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. Hey, just real quick, if you're only interested in hearing about the Northfield raid and nothing else, I did leave a timestamp down below in this episode's description, so please feel free to skip ahead. For everybody else, if you don't mind, I would like to very quickly fill in a few gaps. If you'll recall, it was in late January of 1875 when the Pinkertons attacked the James farm, and that disastrous raid in Northfield wouldn't occur until September 7th, 1876. So what exactly was Jesse James up to in the intervening 19 months? Well, as it turns out, quite a lot. He and the boys allegedly held up a post office north of Clinton, Missouri on May 13th, 1875. According to an eyewitness, quote, "We supposed them to be the James or Younger boys from the way they proceeded. They were professional hands at the business and stole every cent we had in the world." Naturally, Jesse would publicly deny these accusations. Strangely enough, he'd also give up the names of those he claimed were guilty, including his buddies Clell Miller and Cole Younger. Not only that, but he also provided authorities with addresses where said fugitives could be located, which prompted Cole Younger to write a letter of his own to the newspapers, denying these allegations and saying that he and Jesse were no longer on good terms. Now, there are many who think this was simply a joint effort on the part of the outlaws to make it appear as if there was dissension in the ranks. That said, I do think there was at least a little friction between Jesse and Cole. Remember, Cole was Jesse's elder by almost 4 years, and he very well may have resented the younger man's rapid ascension to leadership. What's more, according to a former Missouri prosecutor, Cole was the only member of the gang who could keep Jesse's murderous tendencies under control. Quote, "Those who knew both men well told me in a number of instances that Cole Younger, at his own peril, prevented Jesse from taking life." End of quote. So who knows, man? Maybe Cole was just growing weary of always having to babysit. And maybe he wasn't all that happy with the way Jesse was conducting himself. For what it's worth, though, they would continue riding together. So apparently, things weren't quite as bad as the papers made them out to be. As a matter of fact, later on that same year, Cole would lead the gang in a bank robbery all the way over in Huntington, West Virginia. Joining him was Thomas Webb, who sometimes used the alias of Jack Keene, Tom McDaniel, brother of Bud McDaniel, who perished after that Muncie train robbery, and possibly Jesse's brother Frank. I say possibly because there does seem to be a bit of disagreement among historians. There are some who think it was Clell Miller as opposed to Frank James. Either way, it was a pretty lucrative heist. They made off with around $10,000 in cash and an additional $5,000 worth of certificates of deposit. The bandits were pursued, and there was a brief skirmish as they escaped into Kentucky, but so far as I'm aware, nobody was injured. At least not until they made the mistake of stopping at a stranger's farm near the town of Pine Hill. I reckon the farmer didn't much like the looks of these four desperados riding up to his house, so he opened fire. The next morning, gang member Tom McDaniel was found in the nearby cornfield, mortally wounded. This was followed by the arrest of Thomas Webb over in Tennessee. He'd later be convicted and sentenced to over a decade behind bars. As for Cole and the fourth robber, they remained elusive. But why didn't Jesse James take part in this holdup? Well, I can't really say for certain. I suppose it could have been due to him and Cole button heads, but I think the most likely explanation is that just a few days prior to the robbery, Jesse and his wife C welcomed their first child, a boy they named Jesse Edward James. That being the case, I do think the most likely scenario is that Jesse just chose to remain home to be with his wife. Of course, by that point, he and Z were already residing in Nashville. It's there where Jesse took on the alias of John Davis Howard, a quiet and unassuming wheat speculator with a penchant for fine horses. He also began spending more and more time at his Uncle George Heights place, just 40 miles to the north. And in doing so, he also got reacquainted with his cousins, Wood and George Jr. According to Jr., Jesse wanted to quit the business, but said he had to make a living. And as the whole world seemed to be pitted against him, and he couldn't do anything else, he kept on with it. George would also claim that Jesse had spent months in Chicago during this same period with the hopes of assassinating Alan Pinkerton. He did locate Pinkerton, but it wasn't enough for Jesse just to walk up and put a bullet in the back of the famous detective's head. He wanted Pinkerton to know who was killing him. Quote, "I want him to know who did it. It would do me no good if I couldn't tell him about it before he died. I had a dozen chances to shoot him when he didn't know it. I wanted to give him a fair chance, but the opportunity never came." Once again, whether or not that's true, I'm not entirely sure. Nevertheless, there is evidence that Jesse would try to do the same exact thing up in Minnesota a year later. More on that here in a bit. Meanwhile, he moved his family to Baltimore. This would actually become a very common occurrence going forward. Anytime Jesse got paranoid, especially after one of his buddies was arrested, like what just happened to Tom Webb, he'd uproot his family and change locations. His brother Frank would also move to Baltimore, and shortly thereafter, per sources, he and Jesse spent around the next several months slowly building a network of narcotics traffickers. Now, I found this to be absolutely fascinating. Not only is it a very underreported period of Jesse's life, but a lot of people just aren't aware that HBO's The Wire was loosely based on he and his brother's activities there in Baltimore. According to show creator David Simon, quote, "I wrote the characters of Avon Barksdale and Stringer Bell specifically with Jesse and Frank James in mind. Detectives McNulty and Moreland represent the rank-and-file law enforcement officers who attempted to stymie their illegal narcotics operations in Baltimore. Unfortunately, HBO was not interested in making westerns, so I changed the theme to more of a modern urban vibe. And finally, after months of negotiations, it did receive the green light." End of quote. Gotta love The Wire, by the way. Even though they changed the format, it really is an amazing show. If you haven't seen it already, please do yourself a favor. I know I talk a lot about Deadwood and The Sopranos, but The Wire is definitely right up there with them. And yes, I did totally make up everything I just said about The Wire being based on the James brothers. That was a lie. Also, as far as I know, Jesse and Frank were never involved in narcotics. That said, they did indeed spend about a year in Baltimore. That much was true. And Frank did have a very close call with the Baltimore PD on at least one occasion. He returned home one evening, only to find a bunch of cops milling around outside his house. Frank approached warily, discreetly hiding his pistol under his arm, only to learn that the police were just responding to a death that occurred next door. Per James biographer Ted Yeatman, there would be much closer calls in the months ahead, and the year 1876 would prove to be something of a turning point in the lives of Frank and Jesse James. And yeah, 1876 was most definitely one hell of a year as far as history is concerned. Hell, Chris Wimmer, host of the Legends of the Old West, even wrote a book about it. 1876 is when Custer fell at the Battle of Little Bighorn. It's when the telephone was invented and when Mark Twain gifted us with the adventures of Tom Sawyer. And it's when Wild Bill Hickok drew his last hand. It also just so happens to be the year that Jesse James decided to try his luck up in Minnesota. But first, he had to figure out a way to pay for the trip. And what better way to pick up a little spending money than by robbing a gosh darn train. That being the case, Jesse returned to his old stomping grounds in Missouri in either late May or early June and began assembling a crew. Joining him on this latest endeavor would be his older brother Frank, Cole Younger, Cole's brother Bob, Clell Miller, Charlie Pitts, Bill Chadwell, and a newcomer by the name of Hobbs Carey. Now, obviously, you're already well acquainted with the James boys and Cole Younger. We've also talked quite a bit about Clell Miller, but just as a quick refresher, Miller first joined up with Bill Anderson and the Bushwhackers when he was 14 years old. Skip ahead to 1871, and he helped Jesse rob a bank up in Iowa. He was also present when they robbed that train over in Kansas. Miller may have been a little on the young side, but so far as Jesse and the others were concerned, he was solid. But then again, so was Charlie Pitts, whose real name, by the way, was Samuel Wells. Now, Charlie had actually grown up with the Youngers. Matter of fact, it was Charlie who discovered the body of Cole's father after he was murdered by Kansas Redlegs. A couple months later, Pitt's own father would be shot dead while cheering on the Confederates during the Battle of White Oak Creek. I'm not entirely sure if he ever served with the Bushwhackers, but his older brother would. I also found a source alleging that Charlie's uncle was none other than the infamous guerrilla George Shepard. Also, this next part isn't really important, I just found it interesting, but supposedly, Charlie Pitts had ridiculously small feet. I kid you not, dude wore a size 6. Something tells me he was fond of saying stuff like, "It's not the size of the boat, but the motion of the ocean." But hey, I could be wrong. Next comes Bill Chadwell, also known as Bill Stiles. Now, this guy can be a bit confusing. For the longest time, it was assumed that Chadwell was just an alias. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Stiles was the alias, and Chadwell was his real name. He was born in Illinois during the early 1850s, and at some point in the next decade or so, his family would migrate to Kansas. Those who knew him described Bill as a hard-working and inoffensive young man, whose only real flaw was being easily influenced by others. He and Charlie Pitts became good buddies and even robbed a bank together over in Baxter Springs, Kansas, prior to linking up with Jesse James. Next, we've got Bob Younger, the youngest of Cole's brothers. Bob was born a little too late to fight alongside the guerrillas, but he was nonetheless deeply impacted by the war. Years later, he'd state, "If it hadn't been for the war, I might have been something, but as it is, I am what I am." Bob first joined the gang at just 19 years of age, and he helped rob a series of trains in Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri. And finally, we've got the least experienced member of the crew, Hobbs Carey. Originally from Arkansas, Carey's family settled in Missouri in the late 1850s. And by 1875, he was already running buddies with Chadwell and Pitts. He was also acquainted with Cole Younger's half-brother, Bruce Younger. Fun fact, just a couple of years later, Bruce Younger would marry Belle Starr. Allegedly. She got married again to Sam Starr just a couple of months later, so I'm assuming it was not a very happy marriage. Now, regarding Chadwell, Pitts, and Carey, there's a whole lot more involved with their initiation into the gang, but long story short, they were able to work their way into Jesse's good graces, just in time to take part in the next train robbery, one that would occur on the night of July 7th, 1876, not too far from Otterville, Missouri, in a little secluded area known as Rocky Cut. According to one of the rail employees, quote, "The scene was wild. Women shrieked, some fainted, and many of the men crawled under the seats of the cars. Some began to take out their money and jewelry for the purpose of hiding it under the seats, but others, utterly paralyzed, remained in the seats, blanched and trembling. Meanwhile, the yells and pistol shots continued, and the passengers had every reason to believe that a massacre was in progress." End of quote. Thankfully, there was no massacre, but the gang was able to make off with around $15,000. Per usual, they divvied up the loot before disappearing into the countryside. That's when Hobbs Carey made the mistake of heading home and flashing his money around. Authorities caught wind and arrested him on July 31st, and within less than a week, Carey agreed to cooperate. Not only did he confess to robbing that train at Rocky Cut, but he also named several of his accomplices, Jesse James included. And as was Jesse's habit, he immediately sent a letter to the press calling Hobbs both a liar and a poltroon. A poltroon, by the way, is just a fancy way of saying coward. To quote historian Mark Lee Gardner, despite the gang's incredible ability to stay one step ahead of the authorities after each bank or train robbery, their former gang member Hobbs Carey had made it much hotter for the boys than usual. Private detectives, police officers, and citizen posses traipsed all over western Missouri, southeast Kansas, and even northeast Texas. In the meantime, the James Younger gang needed a change of scenery. And yeah, that change of scenery just so happened to be Minnesota. Now, as to why they chose Minnesota, or more specifically Northfield, this too is heavily debated. To the best of my knowledge, none of them had ever been that far north. But then again, Minnesota was home to quite a few northern banks, and those northern banks contained northern money. Also worth noting that one of Jesse's sworn enemies, Samuel Hardwick, was also residing in Minnesota. If you'll recall, Hardwick was the attorney from Clay County who aided the Pinkertons. As soon as Jesse killed Daniel Askew, Hardwick got nervous and moved to St. Paul. And then, of course, Northfield was also home to former Mississippi Governor Adelbert Ames, a guy who represented pretty much everything that Jesse James hated. Ames graduated 5th in his class at West Point. Interestingly enough, that was the same class that Custer graduated from. Not long thereafter, Ames received a commission as a lieutenant with the 2nd U.S. Artillery. Ended up getting pretty seriously wounded during the First Battle of Bull Run, but he refused to leave his men on the battlefield, an action that would later earn him the Medal of Honor. And from there, Ames continued climbing the ladder. By May of 1863, he was already a brigadier general. Saw action at Gettysburg and numerous other skirmishes before being named as the provisional governor of Mississippi in 1868. And it was there where he stayed until he resigned in 1875. The following years, when he joined his father and brother up in Northfield to help run the family business. He was also one of the primary investors in Northfield's First National Bank. But then again, so was his father-in-law, another despised carpetbagger known as General Benjamin the Beast Butler. It's assumed that it was these connections that caused Jesse to ultimately choose Northfield. That said, I'm not entirely convinced he was aware of any of these details prior to arriving in Minnesota. Truth be told, there's ample evidence that they weren't even planning on robbing any banks and that the trip north was simply a vacation. By the way, joining Jesse up there in Minnesota was pretty much everybody from that last holdup, minus Hobbs Carey, obviously. In his place was Jim Younger. Much like Jesse, Jim had been a child soldier during the Civil War. He was there when Quantrell was killed and ended up being taken prisoner. He was also with his late brother John when they had that gunfight with the Pinkertons. Jim would end up spending a couple of years in California, but by 1876 he was back in Missouri and once again part of the gang. Per historian Ted Yeatman, the gang's mode of travel is likewise disputed. Quote, just how the gang got to Minnesota is described in conflicting accounts, saying that they rode north on horseback, traveled in a covered wagon together, or even moved by train from Missouri. Cole Younger himself would later give different stories. What actually happened may never be known with any certainty. Same goes for the date of their arrival. It can only be said that they arrived sometime in the last 2 weeks of August. End of quote. And yeah, sure enough, by August 23rd, 2 of them checked into a hotel in Minneapolis under assumed names. 3 more of their associates arrived the following day, likewise using aliases. And despite trying to keep a low profile, they stuck out like a bunch of sore thumbs, mostly on account of their southern accents and attire. Not only did they wear spurs and tuck their pants into their boots like country bumpkins, but they also had on matching dusters to conceal their weapons. Now, if you don't mind, I would like to discuss these dusters for just a moment. This is something that the movies get completely wrong. If you've ever seen Frank James starring Rob Lowe and Bill Paxton, or The Great Northfield Raid with Robert Duvall, or even The Long Riders, the dusters shown in those movies are not the same type of dusters worn by the real-life James Younger gang. And we know this because one of them literally left a duster behind in Northfield. You can find a photo online, but the dusters they were wearing didn't even have sleeves. Just an attached cape meant to somewhat protect their arms. And they weren't very long either, just around 44 inches. I actually reached out to my buddy David Lambert. He's an expert not only in Western attire, but Western films. And so far as he's aware, there are no movies as of yet that depict the type of dusters worn by the James Younger crew. Just thought I'd point that out. There were jackets at the time that were very similar to what you see in the movies, sort of like what Deacon Jim Miller is wearing in one of his photos. So they did exist, but that's just not what Jesse and his buddies were wearing when they hit Northfield. So yeah, like I was saying, the boys arrived in Minnesota in late August. And within just a few days, Jesse was paying a visit to a working gal named Molly Ellsworth. Apparently, he and Molly had been acquainted down in St. Louis. And according to her, Jesse said that he was going to, quote, see a man that he knew uptown, end of quote. And historians do believe that this man was Samuel Hardwick, guy I mentioned earlier who helped the Pinkertons attack the James farm. And this was pretty much just a repeat of Jesse's alleged visit to Chicago. According to Mark Gardner, Jesse probably started casing Hardwick's home and his office. And Sam Hardwick, his mind occupied with normal thoughts of work and family, would have gone about his day without the slightest inkling that those burning blue eyes were on him. Yet for whatever reason, Jesse failed to assassinate his quarry. Perhaps Hardwick was out of town and Jesse never saw him, but more than likely, Jesse never felt like he had the perfect opportunity to strike. Mr. Gardner further expands on this in his book, Shot All to Hell. He points out that most writers and historians have missed Hardwick as a major motivation for the Minnesota expedition. However, the contemporary press did not miss the story. An October 15, 1876 letter, written by a visitor to the James farm, gave the Liberty Attorney as the real cause of the robbers going to Minnesota, as did an article originally published in the Boonville Advertiser titled Why It Was the James Boys Went to Minnesota. These articles were also published in the St. Paul Dispatch on October 19, 1876, and the State Journal in Jefferson City, Missouri on October 27, 1876. Clay County locals also knew about the Hardwick connection. Dr. Robert Sheets, son of Dr. Samuel Sheets, who treated the wounded Zerelda in the aftermath of the Pinkerton raid, said that one of the reasons that James went to Minnesota was to kill a certain lawyer from Liberty who had gone to St. Paul to get away from the boys. End quote, and thank you, Mr. Gardner. Now, it wasn't until the boys finally had their fill of gambling and whoring that they set out to the countryside, both to procure some decent horse flesh and to scout out prospective marks. And per at least one somewhat dubious source, their first choice was the bank at Mankato, some 50 or so miles southwest of Northfield. Legend has it that just before the bandits could pull off the heist, Jesse was recognized by a fellow Missourian, so he called it off. Now, this does tie back into what I said earlier about why they traveled to Minnesota in the first place. You know, was it a vacation, or did they go with the express purpose of robbing a bank? And if so, when exactly did they decide on Northfield? Well, according to Cole Younger, their original target, once they decided to rob a bank, was indeed Mankato. Furthermore, Cole would tell a reporter that the trip was a quote-unquote pleasure excursion, and the only reason they decided to rob a bank was due to being short on money. Remember, these guys had just stolen $15,000 back in July, or roughly the equivalent of $440,000 in today's money. And by September, they were already broke. Just goes to show how much fun they were having up there in the land of 10,000 lakes. I don't know, I guess the prostitutes in Minnesota are a lot more expensive than the ones down in Missouri. This episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by Mint Mobile. I don't know about you, but I like keeping my money where I can see it. Unfortunately, traditional big wireless carriers also seem to enjoy keeping my money. And after years of overpaying for wireless, I finally got fed up from all the crazy high wireless bills, bogus fees, and free perks that actually cost more in the long run, and I switched to Mint Mobile. Look, with my last provider, I was paying a little over $100 a month. And with Mint Mobile, I'm not even paying a third of that. And you too can join in on the savings by switching to Mint Mobile. All plans come with high-speed data and unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. And yes, you can use your own phone and even bring your old number and existing contacts. You can also get 3 months of premium wireless service from Mint Mobile for just $15 a month. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/Wild West. That's mintmobile.com/Wild West. Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra, see Mint Mobile for details. This episode is also brought to you by Quince. Look, I'm not a fancy person by any means, but getting to the point that even trying to elevate my style is starting to cost an arm and a leg. But thanks to Quince, I can get high-end, versatile pieces at prices I can actually afford. In other words, I can upgrade my style by snagging killer luxury essentials that are more in sync with my vibe than the sparse contents of my wallet. If you've never heard of Quince, you should definitely check them out. They've got all the must-haves like Mongolian cashmere, crew neck sweaters from just $50, iconic 100% leather jackets, and even versatile flow knit activewear. The best part is that all Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. They're able to do so by partnering with top factories and thus cutting out the middleman. By the way, Quince only partners with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices, along with premium fabrics and finishes. I personally got some of their fancy percale sheets, and let me tell you, I have never slept better. I also got my daughter a pair of their bamboo pajamas that she absolutely loves. So do yourself a favor and indulge in affordable luxury. Go to quince.com/wildwest for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/wildwest to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/wildwest. Now, let's get back to the show. Cole would also state that they ultimately selected Northfield on account of Adelbert Ames being one of the bank's investors. According to Cole, one of his fellow gang members, probably Jesse James, had a grudge against Ames. This is further backed up by Cole's brother Bob. A reporter from the Minneapolis Tribune, who interviewed Bob in late September, wrote that the, quote, raid in Minnesota was not intentional. They came for pleasure but learned ex-Governor Ames of Mississippi had money in the Northfield Bank. One of the boys had a spite against him, so the robbery was planned to pay expenses. Either way, whatever their motivations, the gang would reunite there in Northfield on the morning of September 7th. They spent the next few hours just sort of milling about in groups of twos and threes. Per George Bates, the town druggist, the men had a reckless, bold swagger about them that seemed to indicate they would be rough and dangerous fellows to handle. Two of them ended up visiting a restaurant at around 11 a.m., loudly discussing politics as they dined on ham and eggs. The others reportedly whiled away the morning to a Northfield saloons, sipping on whiskey and wine and periodically checking their pocket watches. Finally, they linked back up for one last briefing. According to Cole Younger, quote, early in the afternoon, we rode back to the Janesfield Road, 2 or 3 miles, to consult and arrange our plans. We agreed by a majority vote to rob the bank. 3 were to ride ahead and enter the bank as soon as Clell Miller and myself had crossed the bridge leading into the square. Another quarter of a mile behind us, the remaining 3, including Jim Younger, were to take their stand near the bridge. If the alarm was given, I was to signal those at the bridge, and they were to give the rebel yell and fire their pistols in the air to scare the people off the street, end quote. And yeah, around 2 p.m. is when they trotted past the Ames Mill and took up their positions. Just to reiterate and somewhat clarify Cole's statement, he and Clell Miller posted up on Division Street, just outside the bank. At the same time, Jesse James, Bill Chadwell, and Jim Younger made their way to the bridge by the square. Not only were they to guard the bridge as an escape route, but in the event that things went south, they were to also intimidate any of the locals who felt like being heroes. And once everybody was in their proper places, that's when Frank James, Charlie Pitts, and Bob Younger rode up to the bank and dismounted. Now, on this day in particular, there were only 3 employees working inside the bank. You had the 39-year-old cashier Joseph Haywood, 28-year-old assistant bookkeeper Frank Wilcox, and a 27-year-old teller named Alonzo Bunker. Believe it or not, just a few days prior, Haywood had been showing off the bank's newfangled time lock to the president of Carleton College, which was also located there in Northfield. Essentially, these time locks worked pretty much as the name suggests. At quitting time, the bankers could set it so the safe wouldn't be unlocked until the next morning, even if you knew the combination. This way, if the bank were robbed and one of the employees managed to set the lock and close the safe, there weren't no way of opening it back up prior to the preordained time. Per historian T.J. Stiles, quote, President Strong of Carleton College had come by to see the new time lock on the bank's safe. Bringing up the wartime robbery of the bank in St. Albans, Vermont by Confederate raiders, Strong had asked Haywood if he would have handed over the money under such circumstances. I do not think I should, Haywood said, according to Strong, with his characteristically quiet manner. And yeah, what they're referring to here was an incident in 1868 where nearly 24 Confederate raiders struck the town of St. Albans and robbed all 3 of the banks, making off with an absurd amount of money. I think it was something like $200,000. They killed at least one of the locals while doing so, and interestingly enough, they even tried to burn the town using Greek fire, something that the Pinkertons had also used on the James farm. If you're not aware of that little incident, check out my last episode. But yeah, basically, Haywood was saying that if a similar robbery occurred there in Northfield, he would refuse to comply with the outlaws. A very chilling statement considering what happened next. Like I said, Frank, Bob, and Charlie Pitts all dismounted outside the bank. They then stepped inside, pistols drawn, and jumped across the counter, telling Haywood and the others to throw their damn hands up. Frank then inquired as to which one of them was the cashier. Haywood responded by saying that the cashier was out, which technically was the truth. The real cashier was over in Philly, attending the 1876 exposition. What Haywood failed to mention was that in the cashier's absence, he himself was acting cashier. The bandits momentarily turned their attention to Bunker and Wilcox, but returned to Haywood soon enough, once again demanding that he open the safe. The safe, by the way, was already unlocked. That's one of the craziest parts of this entire story. Nevertheless, Haywood played dumb and said there wasn't any possible way that he could unlock the safe on account of that time lock. And he continued to hold firm, even when Charlie Pitts held a knife to his throat, saying that he was going to cut him from ear to ear. And when Haywood started yelling for help, that's when Frank pistol whipped him. Not only that, but as he struggled to stand back up, one of the outlaws, probably Frank James, fired his pistol off just above Haywood's head. A shot that was meant to intimidate. And sure enough, the teller, Alonzo Bunker, decided he had enough and took off running out the back door into an alley. Charlie Pitts followed and even managed to shoot Bunker in the shoulder, but he was still able to escape. He'd later recalled that the sensation of being shot was as though someone had struck me a sharp blow with a piece of board. There was a jar and a sting, and I felt the bullet going through the bones of my shoulder. Ew. Of course, by that point, Bunker's dash for freedom was the least of the outlaws' worries. Turns out the good folks in Northfield had already put two and two together, and you better believe they weren't going to sit back and idly watch as a bunch of damn thugs made off with their hard-earned money. That's another thing. This was back when banks were not insured. If you were living in Northfield and you had money in the bank and the bank was robbed, you were just shit out of luck. Now, just moments after Frank and the others had stepped inside, a guy by the name of J.S. Allen approached the bank and started peering through the window. A decision that damn near cost him his life. Remember, Cole Younger and Clell Miller were keeping a lookout. That being the case, Miller was able to grab Allen by his collar and shove a pistol in his face, saying, "You son of a bitch, don't you holler." That's when another bystander, 22-year-old medical student Henry Willer, started yelling out that the bank was being robbed. Miller shoved Allen aside long enough to squeeze off a round at Willer, but he missed. Luckily, that was all Allen needed to escape, and as he ran, he too began sounding the alarm, while at the same time exhorting his fellow citizens to arm themselves. Keep in mind that all of this is happening very, very quickly. I don't know who shot first, whether it was Clell Miller or Frank James, but I doubt they'd been inside that bank longer than a couple of minutes before the townsfolk began fighting back. That's about the same time that Cole and Clell Miller mounted their ponies and started firing their pistols in the air. Most of the time, this was a successful tactic, but like I said earlier, I guess the residents of Northfield weren't so easily intimidated. Meanwhile, Jesse and his bunch had likewise taken to the saddle. They too began galloping up and down the street, yelling and shooting their guns. And from there, things very quickly began to fall apart. Remember that Allen guy I mentioned a moment ago? Well, as it turns out, he owned a hardware store. That's back in the good old days when hardware stores carried guns. And in no time flat, Allen began handing out firearms to his fellow residents, one of whom was a farmer by the name of Elias Stacy, who ended up blowing Clell Miller plumb off his horse. Luckily for Clell, it was just birdshot, but I gotta imagine it still stung quite a bit. I don't know if I've ever shared this story before, but my dad actually got shot in the face with birdshot many years ago. I remember when I was a kid, you could still see the pellets under his skin. Every now and then, one of them will just sort of work its way out, and if I'm not mistaken, he's still got a few of them in there. Suffice it to say, I would not recommend getting shot in the face with birdshot. Anyway, like I said, Miller was hurt, but he did manage to shrug it off and get back in the saddle. That's when another Northfield resident, Ansel Manning, squeezed off a shot with a Remington rolling block chambered in .45-70. He missed the outlaws, but he did manage to kill Bob Younger's horse before his rifle jammed. Another local, George Bates, was also dealing with a jammed-up gun, so he just tossed it aside and got a revolver. And as luck would have it, the revolver was empty. So rather than scurrying around trying to locate ammo, Bates just pretended to shoot at the outlaws. I am not kidding. He'd periodically pop up, pointing the pistol and yell, "Now I've got you," and then immediately duck back under cover as the bandits turned to shoot at him. And he wasn't the only one not using a gun. Apparently, even the town marshal was unarmed and reduced to just throwing rocks. Sounds pretty silly, but they were at least able to temporarily distract the outlaws. And just to add to all the confusion, there were some there in Northfield who thought that this whole damn thing was just a show. There was a special event planned for later on that evening, and I guess they just thought that the scene being played out in the street was just some type of a live-action advertisement. The town dentist, however, a guy named Danford Whitney, knew better. He too armed himself and began firing at the desperados. So did the undertaker Theodore Miller. I can only assume he was excited about getting a few new customers. And that medical student, Henry Willer, who I mentioned earlier, well, he too had procured a firearm, an old 50 caliber carbine that he began shooting from the third floor of the hotel. He narrowly missed Jim Younger, but then took careful aim, squeezed the trigger, and sent a bullet straight through Clell Miller's shoulder, severing his subclavian artery. According to Mark Lee Gardner, Clell then fell off his horse, but managed to get up on his knees. He appeared to be yelling orders to the other robbers before his heart finally pumped the last of his blood and he toppled over onto his face. As Cole Younger ran to Miller's aid, he too was shot, taken around from Manning's rolling block to his left hip. That's when Adelbert Ames entered the fray. Kind of. He wasn't armed, but he was crouched next to Manning, the guy who had just shot Cole. The former general was basically talking to Manning like he used to talk to his own soldiers, urging him to remain calm and to take careful aim. And evidently it worked, as Manning's next round hit Bill Chadwell square in the chest. Per an eyewitness, quote, "I saw him, Chadwell, reel in the saddle and nearly fall off. He threw his left arm around the horse's neck, and that turned the horse up the street again, and he came as far as my door, where he fell off and died after a short period of intense suffering." Now, by this point, Cole Younger was probably wondering why in the hell Frank and them others were taking their own sweet damn time inside the bank. He started yelling at them to wrap things up. He also shot a drunk who had the misfortune of stumbling out of the saloon at absolutely the worst time imaginable. The victim, Swedish immigrant Nicholas Gustavsson, took Cole's bullet to the right side of his head, and believe it or not, he was still alive, albeit temporarily paralyzed. More on him in just a moment. By the way, if you're wondering what Jesse James was up to as all this was happening, he and Jim Younger were still riding up and down the street, yelling their rebel war cries and shooting pistols. Meanwhile, Frank still hadn't managed to get Haywood to open up that damn safe. Finally, at Cole's urgings, he and Pitts hopped back across the counter and headed for the door. That's when Frank paused, turned around, and squeezed off a shot at the stubborn Haywood. The bullet missed, but Frank quickly thumbed back the hammer again. According to that bookkeeper Wilcox, he then put the pistol almost at Haywood's head and fired the fatal shot. To once again quote the great Mark Lee Gardner, the bullet entered Haywood's left temple, spraying blood and brain matter all over the desk. He tumbled forward and fell behind the counter. Face down, his body heaved slightly as his lungs continued to breathe for some minutes, blood running out of a hole in his skull. Haywood had prevented another St. Albans, just like he said he would, but his heroics had cost him his life. Now, as Frank and Pitts ran outside, they began to realize just how dire things had truly become. Miller and Chadwell were dead. Bob Younger had taken a round to his left elbow, courtesy of Henry Willer. His brothers Jim and Cole were likewise wounded. Jim was shot in the shoulder and Cole in the left hip. Even Frank James took a round to the leg as soon as he stepped outside the bank. Just weren't no two ways about it. They needed to leave town immediately. And that's basically what they did, fleeing under a hell of gunfire. The entire ordeal lasted no longer than 10 minutes, maybe even less. And the only money they were able to take away from the bank was just a mere $26.60. I'll say it again, $26.60. Per T.J. Stiles in his book Jesse James' Last Rebel, quote, "In Northfield, the citizens slowly emerged from their hiding places, some still gripping rifles and shotguns. They bent down to examine the corpses in the street. They filed into the bank to find the bloody remains of Haywood, and John Ames ran to the telegraph office to wire an alert that would spark a statewide manhunt. They had won, but at a bitter cost, and in the days and years to come, they would wonder why this band of Missourians had come here, hundreds of miles from their hunting grounds, to rob a modest bank in a modest town. It was a question they could never properly answer for themselves. The next morning, the one man who could put the question in its proper context was at the bank, standing where Jesse James had so recently stood, counting money with the other shareholders. Adelbert Ames soon discovered that the robbers had taken virtually nothing. As the manhunt progressed, however, the bank would deplete its capital by a quarter as it paid rewards and supported Haywood's widow. And yeah, speaking of Haywood's widow, she was said to have been inconsolable. certainly can't blame her there, right? And when she learned of how her husband died, protecting the town's money, she stated that she wouldn't have had him do otherwise. By the way, that safe was not locked. All Frank James had to do was just walk on over, open it up. And had he done so, they would have found around $15,000 inside. But as it were, they were forced to leave practically empty-handed. Now, as far as the guy who Charlie Pitts shot in the shoulder, Alonzo Bunker, he would recover and live all the way until 1929. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for that Swede who Cole shot in the head. He was able to make it to his feet and even have his head checked out by a doctor. But by the next morning, due to his brain swelling, he couldn't even get out of bed. Day after that, he fell into a coma, and then on September 11th is when he finally gave up the ghost. Another one of the residents, George Bates, had also sustained a wound, but it was relatively minor. According to him, one of the outlaw's bullets had grazed the bridge of his nose. He ended up digging the bullet out of a wall and keeping it as a souvenir. And yeah, that was the great Northfield raid in a nutshell. Like I said, all the outlaws were either dead or wounded, save for Jesse and Charlie Pitts. Pitts would not remain in the land of the living for long. He too would be dead in just a couple of weeks. Only Jesse and Frank made it out of Minnesota as free men, but not without both of them receiving additional wounds in the process. And really, as far as I'm concerned, the manhunt that followed their leaving town is way more exciting than that failed bank robbery. I physically cringed several times when I read about what the bandits had to endure as they tried to escape. And that is what we'll be discussing next time. First, though, before you go, I would like to talk about sources. The 3 books that I relied on heavily while researching this series were Jesse James, The Last Rebel of the Civil War by T.J. Stiles, Shot All to Hell by Mark Lee Gardner, and Frank and Jesse James by Ted Yeatman. Here's the thing, though. History can be very tricky. New information is always being uncovered, and at the end of the day, nobody's perfect. That being the case, none of those sources that I just mentioned are in complete agreement on everything. And one of the main disagreements seems to be whether or not it was Jesse or Frank who killed Joseph Haywood. For instance, T.J. Stiles places Jesse inside the bank during the robbery. He also writes that Jesse was most likely Haywood's killer. And Mr. Yeatman simply refers to the killer as probably being one of the James brothers. In Mark Gardner's version, however, the one that I ultimately ended up going with, he has Jesse doing crowd control outside of the bank while Frank was inside trying to get that safe open. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read directly from Mr. Gardner's book, Shot All to Hell, which, by the way, does have the advantage of being published over a decade after those others that I mentioned. Quote, identifying the robbers inside the bank and those guarding on the street has been a source of considerable debate for the last 136 years. It seems like it should be fairly straightforward. As for those in the bank employees Bunker and Wilcox were in agreement in identifying Charlie Pitts and Bob Younger as 2 of the 3 inside men. But it is the identification of the 3rd inside man, the robber who shot and killed Joseph Lee Haywood, that has been the source of so much speculation and argument. The Youngers refused to provide the authorities with the name of this man, at the same time denying that the James brothers were ever part of the raid. Modern authors and historians love to name Jesse James as the 3rd man. The impulse killing of Haywood fits with what many believe to be Jesse's volatile personality, his supposed hot-headedness, and of course, his revengefulness. But Wilcox, an eyewitness to the shooting, believed Haywood's killer to be Frank James. In fact, Wilcox came to this conclusion after making a personal visit to the Jackson County, Missouri jail to see Frank after the outlaws' surrender in 1882. So if Frank, Bob, and Charlie were in the bank, that leaves Jesse, Cole, Jim, Clell Miller, and Bill Chadwell outside. Cole wrote that he and Miller were the 2 who followed the inside men to Division Street, which leaves Jesse, Jim, and Chadwell as the robbers who were guarding the escape route at the bridge in Mill Square. End of quote, and thank you for such a detailed explanation. Now, just to add to all of that, you don't really hear all that much about Frank James being a cold-blooded killer. But you gotta remember, he did take part in the Lawrence Massacre. Frank was right there with Jesse when they killed their neighbors and all those other unarmed soldiers at Centralia. Make no mistake about it, Frank James was just as deadly, if not more so, than his famous little brother. He may have been a little on the quiet side, he may have not been as reckless, but Frank certainly weren't no Sunday school teacher. He'd become one in the future, but in 1876 he was still about as deadly as they came. Speaking of the future, once again, like I said last week, I do not know if I'll have a new episode ready by next Wednesday. I'm really getting down to the nut cutting here and constantly pushing my deadlines. We have still got a lot of ground to cover though, including Jesse and Frank's escape from Minnesota, their future robberies, and Jesse's ultimate and untimely demise. I am working diligently to finish this series, but it just takes time. Alright, that's it for this week. Till next time, whenever that may be, adios.